Welcome to this important conversation. My name is Abebe, and I am an engineer, the founder of AHP, Ethiopian Hearts for Peace, and AHP, African Hearts for Peace. I am a truth seeker, a peace advocate, and someone who has never been involved in politics. My mission is to remove as many conscious and subconscious biases as humanly possible and pursue the truth with clarity and integrity. Today, we embark on a critical dialogue, an AI-mediated discussion on the long-standing conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. This is not a political debate, but an honest effort to understand historical grievances, acknowledge realities, and explore a path forward peace. We will present facts, analyze perspectives, and engage in a structured mediation that prioritizes reconciliation over division. Let's begin this journey toward truth and lasting peace. Eritrean grievances, historically and in contemporary context, revolve around several key issues, both in relation to Ethiopia and internally within Eritrea. These grievances include 1. Historical grievances against Ethiopia. Annexation and Federation, 1950s to 1960s. Eritreans widely opposed Ethiopia's annexation of Eritrea after United Nations federated it with Ethiopia in 1952. The gradual erosion of autonomy under Emperor Haile Selassie led to resistance. War for Independence 1961 to 1991. Eritreans fought at a 30-year war against Ethiopia for independence, citing forced assimilation, political separation, and economic exploitation. Border War 1998 to 2000 and unresolved disputes. The Ethiopian-Eritrean War over Abebe resulted in tens of thousands of deaths. Although international rulings favored Eritrea, Ethiopia refused to cede disputed territories until 2018. Eritreans felt betrayed by the international community for not enforcing legal rulings. 2. Internal grievances within Eritrea. Authoritarian rule. President Isaias Afwerki's government has ruled Eritrea since independence, without elections, leading to widespread dissatisfaction with lack of political freedoms. Mandatory military service. Eritreans' indefinite national service, often described as forced labor, has caused mass youth migration. Economic hardship. Sanctions, lack of foreign investment, and government control over the economy have stifled opportunities, leading to frustration among citizens. However, some Eritreans think that Eritrea's independence and self-sufficiency is a national pride. Suppression of free speech and dissent. Excuse me. Political opposition and independent media are banned, with journalists and activists imprisoned. 3. Diaspora and identity issues. Mistrust towards Ethiopia. Some Eritreans believe Ethiopian political elites still have ambitions over Eritrea, fueling skepticism despite the 2018 peace deal. Division among Eritreans. Some support the government's strong nationalist stance, while others in the diaspora oppose its authoritarian and seek democratic reforms. Eritrean perspective on their historical status before annexation by Ethiopia vary, and much depend on how one interprets pre-colonial political structures. Let's break it down. 1. Eritrean views on pre-colonial independence. Many Eritreans argue that Eritrea as a distinct entity was shaped by colonial rule rather than being historically a part of Ethiopia. However, before colonial rule, the territories that make up modern Eritrea were part of various Ethiopian and regional political entities. Some Eritreans emphasize colonial creation of Eritrea. Eritrea as a defined entity was established by Italy in 1890. Some Eritreans argue that before this, the region was a collection of smaller political units, not a unified part of Ethiopia. Local autonomy. Certain Eritrean highland and lowland groups had previous periods of local rule and autonomy, separate from centralized Ethiopian control. Diverse ethnic and cultural identity. Some Eritreans claim their unique mix of Christian and Muslim population influenced by Ottoman, Egyptian, and Italian rule sets them apart from Ethiopia's historical identity. 2. Ethiopian perspective. Eritrea was historically part of Ethiopia. From an Ethiopian viewpoint, Eritrea was historically part of Ethiopia, and its separation was due to colonial occupation rather than an independent past. Ethiopian argue. Aksumite Kingdom. Much of Eritrea, especially the highlands, was integral to the Aksumite Kingdom, 1st century to 7th century, which is seen as an early Ethiopian civilization. Coming to medieval Ethiopian rule during the Zagwe and Solomonic dynasty, 12th century to 19th century, the highlands of Eritrea were highly under Ethiopian influence, though local rulers sometimes had autonomy. Italian colonialism as a divider. Italy's colonization of Eritrea in 1890 separated it from Ethiopia, preventing it from naturally developing as part of the Ethiopian state. 3. Was Eritrea independent from colonial rule? Eritrea was never a unified independent nation state before colonial rule. Instead, its territories were historically under various rulers. Aksumite Kingdom, 1st to 7th century, Eritrean highlands were central to the Aksumite civilization. Medri Bahari, 16th to 19th century, the Christian kingdom of Medri Bahari ruled Bahari Nagasi, Sea King, governed parts of Eritrea but was linked to Ethiopia. Ottoman and Egyptian control, 16th to 19th century. Ottoman Turks and later Egyptians ruled Eritrean coastal areas, reducing Ethiopian influence. 4. The modern conflict over identity. Eritrean nationalists view Eritrea was distinct and unfairly annexed by Ethiopian after Italian rule ended. Ethiopian unity view Eritrea was part of Ethiopia before colonialism, and its separation was a colonial legacy rather than an organic historical development. Yes, some Eritreans, especially those who supported the independence movement, argue that Ethiopia itself acted as a colonial power over Eritrean rather than simply being a historically unified entity. This perspective stems from how Eritrea was governed under Ethiopian rule from the 1950s to 1991. 1. Eritrean view. Ethiopia as a colonial power over Eritrea. Eritrean nationalists argue that Ethiopia's annexation of Eritrea was not a natural reunification, but rather an act of imperial expansion, similar to European colonialism. Their argument include UN-imposed federation, 1952. Eritrea was federated with Ethiopia under international pressure, not through an organic process. Many Eritreans view this as an external imposition that denied them their right to self-determination. Dissolution of autonomy. In 1962, Ethiopia unilaterally abolished the federation and annexed Eritrea, suppressing local political and cultural freedoms, which Eritrean nationalists likened to colonial rule. Military occupation and war crimes. During the Eritrean War of Independence, 1961 to 1991, Ethiopia's military, under both Emperor Haile Selassie and later the Derg regime, used force to control Eritrea, leading to destruction, civilian massacres, and economic exploitation, paralleling colonial repression. Exploitation of Eritrean resources. Ethiopia benefited from Eritrea's ports, industries, and labor force without providing self-governance, reinforcing the idea that Eritrea was treated as a colony rather than an integral region. 2. Does this argument extend to Djibouti? Eritrea's view of Ethiopia as a colonial power does not necessarily extend to Djibouti in the same way. However, some Eritreans and even some Djiboutians argue that Ethiopia has long tried to dominate Djibouti economically and politically. Ethiopian economic dependence on Djibouti. Ethiopia relies heavily on Djibouti's port, leading to influence over Djibouti's policies. Some view this as a form of indirect control. Geopolitical influence. Ethiopia has historically tried to exert influence over Djibouti to ensure access to the sea. Sorowet has never ruled Djibouti directly like it did Eritrea. 3. Ethiopian counter-argument. Eritrea was always part of Ethiopia. From an Ethiopian perspective, the view that Ethiopia colonized Eritrea is historically incorrect because Eritrea was an integral part of Ethiopian history before Italian colonization, Aksum Empire, Medri Bahari. Eritrea's separation was due to Italian colonialism, and Ethiopia was merely reclaiming a lost territory. Ethiopia itself was a victim of colonial aggression, resisting European imperialism while Eritrea was under Italian rule. The root of the dispute. 4. At the heart of the debate is whether Eritrea was historically a separate entity or just a region of Ethiopia before Italian colonialism. Eritrean nationalists argue that Ethiopia imposed foreign rule over them, while Ethiopian unity advocates see Eritrea as historically Ethiopian. Eritrea and Ethiopia, a historical analysis beyond rhetoric, AI generated. First to 7th century, the Aksumite foundation. The origin of both Ethiopia and Eritrea can be traced back to the kingdom of Aksum, 1st to 7th century CE, one of the most powerful civilizations in the region. Aksum's capital was in present-day Ethiopia, but its control extends across the northern Ethiopian highlands, parts of modern Eritrea, and coastal areas along the Red Sea. Common heritage. Aksum was a hub for trade, governance, and early Christianity, tying together the highlands of Ethiopia and Eritrea under one civilization. The role of Adulis, Eritrea's ancient port. The port of Adulis, near present-day Massawa, was Aksum's main gateway to the Roman, Persian, and Indian worlds. Eritrean highlands provided a vital link in Aksum's prosperity. Despite this shared history, Aksum's control over its northern region was not always firm. While Eritrea's highlands were integrated into the Aksumite world, its coastal lowlands had different influences, especially from Arabian, Egyptian, and later Ottoman traders. 7th to 16th century fragmentation and external influences. The rise of Islam in the 7th century reshaped the geopolitical dynamics of the Horn of Africa. As Arab Muslim states gained control over Red Sea trade, Aksum lost access to the sea. Eritrea's coastal areas, Mazawa and beyond, come under Arab and later Ottoman influence, while its highlands remained linked to the Ethiopian Christian kingdom. By the 16th century, the Ottoman formally occupied parts of Eritrea's coast and the Dahlak archipelago. Sorry for mispronunciation. Meanwhile, Ethiopia under the Solomonic dynasty was engaged in wars with Adal Sultanate, Somalia, and the Ottomans. Here lies a crucial divergence. Eritrea's coast was drawn into Ottoman, Egyptian, and later Italian influence. Eritrea's highlands remained culturally tied to Ethiopia, but were loosely governed as Ethiopia's central authority weakened due to internal struggles. Was this a case of an emerging Eritrean national identity, or simply the shifting of external rulers? The truth is complex. While Eritrea's coastal identity drifted towards external powers, its highlands were never entirely separate from Ethiopia. 19th century, the colonial carve up. The 19th century saw European colonial ambitions collide with Ethiopia's imperial restoration under Emperor Menelik II. In 1869, the opening of the Suez Canal made the Red Sea even more valuable. In 1882, Italy formally entered the Horn of Africa, first taking Assab, southern Eritrea, and later expanding northward. By 1890, Italy declared Eritrea a colony, severing it politically from Ethiopia for the first time in history. The real question: was this separation an unnatural colonial division, or did Italy merely formalize a growing regional distinction? Ethiopians argue Italy interrupted a historical unity that had existed for centuries. Eritrea was always part of Ethiopia, and the Italian colonial project was a foreign imposition. Eritreans argue Italy's rule solidified Eritrea as a distinct entity, with industrialization, modern education, and infrastructure separate from Ethiopia. Both perspectives have truths in them. Italy shaped modern Eritrea in ways that Ethiopia did not, but it also created an identity that may not have fully formed without colonial intervention. 1950s to 1991, federation, annexation, and war. After World War II, Eritrea's fate was uncertain. The British briefly controlled it, but the United Nations federated Eritrea with Ethiopia in 1952 rather than granting outright independence. Ethiopia under Haile Selassie annexed Eritrea in 1962, sparking resistance. Eritrean liberation movements led by ELF and later EPLF saw Ethiopian rule as colonial domination rather than national unity. Ethiopia argued it was merely reclaiming lost territory, but Eritreans saw the annexation as a denial of their right to self-determination. After 30 years of war, Eritrea won independence in 1991. Ethiopia recognized this in 1993. The war in the making 2025 and beyond. Despite Eritrean independence, tension remains. The 1998 to 2000 war over Abebe showed that the territorial disputes were unresolved. Even the 2018 peace agreement between Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki and Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed did not eliminate deeper distrust. Today, new colonial geopolitical alignments, economic pressure, and military tensions are pulling Ethiopia and Eritrea into another confrontation. Ethiopia still lacks a secure port. Djibouti is costly, and Eritrean ports remain unused. This economic necessity could fuel future conflicts. Eritrea remains militarized and distrustful, seeing Ethiopia's internal instability as a potential threat or an opportunity to assert dominance over weakened Ethiopian factions. Ethiopian nationalism is re-emerging, with some voices still claiming Eritrea should have never separated. The Red Sea's increasing strategic value is drawing global powers into the region. External forces, including Gulf states, the West, and China, have competing interests in keeping Ethiopia landlocked or pushing for reintegration with Eritrea. If history teaches anything, it is that war is not inevitable, but neither is peace guaranteed. Final thoughts: a truce beyond nationalism. The Eritrean-Ethiopian relationship is not a simple story of colonization or unity. It is a story of shifting powers, economic needs, and political manipulation. Eritrea was never a fully independent entity before colonialism, but neither was it a mere province of Ethiopia throughout history. Ethiopia did not colonize Eritrea in the European sense, but its post-1952 annexation resembles colonial domination. The future will not be determined by who was right in the past, but by who understands the region's historical complexity and acts wisely moving forward. The real question is, will Ethiopia and Eritrea continue to repeat history's mistakes, or will they forge a future beyond wars? This is just the beginning of the analysis. Certainly, the Council of a dialogue between Hagos and Sara got this. Hagos, Eritrea's representative, in his opening statement says, "Thank you, Council of Wisdom, for allowing this dialogue. Eritrea's history is one of betrayal and struggle. We were part of Ethiopia's ancient civilization, but we had a distinct role. Our coast connected us to the world. When Italy colonized us, we became separate from Ethiopia for over 60 years, developing our own identity. After World War II, we were forced into Ethiopia against our will, and when we resisted annexation, Ethiopia waged a brutal war against us. Even after independence, Ethiopia still tries to dominate us, whether economically or through military intervention. How can Ethiopia claim unity when it has never respected Eritrean sovereignty?" Now Sara, Ethiopia's representative, speaks. "I appreciate the chance to address this. Hagos, you speak of betrayal, but we too feel betrayed. Eritrea was always part of Ethiopia's historical core. Yes, Italy colonized you, but did that erase 2,000 years of shared history? When Eritrea gained independence in 1993, Ethiopia accepted it. Yet, instead of peace, we got the 1998 war, with Eritrean forces seizing Badme. Ethiopia's lost access to the Red Sea, making it dependent on Djibouti. Was independence truly about self-determination, or was it a Western-backed strategy to weaken Ethiopia by making it landlocked? Historical Grievances by Hagos, Eritrea. You speak as if Ethiopia is a victim, but in reality, Ethiopia was a colonial oppressor to us. Haile Selassie dismantled our federation in 1962 and treated us as a conquered province. Eritreans were forced to abandon their language, identity, and governance. The Ethiopian army burned villages, executed civilians, and bombed our people for simply demanding freedom. Ethiopia lost access to the sea because it tried to control us instead of respecting our right to self-rule. Sara from Ethiopia answered, Eritrea was never a colony of Ethiopia. It was reintegrated after Italian occupation. Yes, the federation was dissolved, but Eritrea was given representation within Ethiopia. Tell me, was the struggle for Eritrean independence purely about justice, or was it part of Cold War geopolitics? The EPLF received support from the Soviet Union at times when the US and Western nations. Was Eritrea's independence truly an organic movement, or was it encouraged to fragment Ethiopia and make us weaker? The War and its Consequences by Hagos from Eritrea. Ethiopia should ask itself, why has there never been peace in the region? Because Ethiopia's ruling elites, from Haile Selassie to Mengistu to the modern government, have always sought to dominate instead of cooperate. Eritrea fought for its independence alone, even when the world ignored us. When we won in 1991, Ethiopia should have accepted the reality. But instead, in 1998, Ethiopia started a border war over a few villages, leading to tens of thousands of deaths. This day, Ethiopia refused to honor the Algiers Agreement, which ruled that Badme belonged to Eritrea. Sara from Ethiopia says, you claim Ethiopia refused to cooperate, but let me be honest. Eritrea under Isaias Afwerki has been a militarized state since day one. The Eritrean government is not innocent in regional destabilization. It was supported army groups in Somalia, Sudan, and Ethiopia itself. And in 1998, Eritrean troops invaded Ethiopia and held Badme, provoking war. Ethiopia had no choice but to defend itself. If Eritrea truly wanted peace, why did it ally with Ethiopia's enemies and refuse economic cooperation? Finding Common Ground by Hagos, Eritrea. Sara, despite our past, I will say this. Our people have suffered on both sides. Ordinary Eritreans and Ethiopians do not benefit from the endless conflict. Only the ruling elites do. Eritrea and Ethiopia share too much history to be eternal enemies. But Ethiopia must understand, Eritrea is not its lost province. It's a sovereign nation. Sara from Ethiopia. Hagos, I agree. We are neighbors, whether we like it or not. Ethiopia and Eritrea must redefine their relationship based on mutual respect, not dominance. Ethiopia should not seek to control Eritrea, but Eritrea should also not act as if Ethiopia's struggles are irrelevant. A peaceful, stable Ethiopia is also in Eritrea's best interest. Now comes the final question from the Council of Wisdom. Abebe, Council of Wisdom, you have both made strong arguments. Here is my question. If history is complex and grievances exist on both sides, what is the way forward? Should Eritrea and Ethiopia continue as separate states with hostile distrust, or is there a possibility for unity, whether political, economic, or cultural? How should Hagos and Sara respond on this? You can think of it, but they in the AI they have ChatGPT said that it is a critical question, and we approach it objectively based on historical patterns and the realities of 2025 without catering to propaganda from any side. So the truth behind Eritrean independence, Ethiopia's loss of the Red Sea. 1. The illusion of Ethiopian consent. This is AI talking. 1993 referendum. When Eritrea held its independence referendum in April 1993, over 99% of Eritreans voted for secession. The Ethiopian government under the TPLF-led EPRDF officially accepted the result. However, your observation is correct. This was not a national Ethiopian decision, but rather one dictated by the ruling party. Who was consulted? The Amhara people, as well as other major ethnic groups, were not consulted in a free and fair national referendum. The Ethiopian people at large did not vote on whether Eritrea should secede. The decision was made by the TPLF leadership and its Western allies, not through a nationwide democratic process. Then, why did the TPLF allow it? The TPLF had fought alongside the EPLF against the Mengistu's regime. In return, the TPLF agreed to let Eritrea go as part of its power deal. The Ethiopian Constitution of 1995, which granted ethnic-based secession rights, Article 39, was designed after Eritrea had already left, as the model to keep Ethiopia weak and fragmented. Thus, the loss of access to the sea was not a national Ethiopian decision. It was engineered by the TPLF leadership in partnership with the EPLF and external powers. 2. Colonial grievances and the Red Sea question, 2025 perspective. In 2025, as Ethiopia reassesses its loss of the Red Sea, the argument is shifting. Ethiopia now says the loss of Eritrea was not a legitimate national Ethiopian decision, but a TPLF engineered outcome. The border imposed between Ethiopia and Eritrea was a colonial construct drawn by Italy in the late 19th century. 3. Foreign interests benefited from a landlocked Ethiopia, while Ethiopia suffered economically and geopolitically. Is this a colonial injustice? If we define colonial injustice as the forced fragmentation of historically connected peoples, then the loss of Eritrea can be seen as a colonial outcome, especially considering that Eritrea only existed as a separate entity due to Italian rule. However, Eritrea's argument is that their struggle was not about colonialism, but about self-determination. The question is, can a people claim self-determination if the historical framework of their separation was imposed by foreign colonizers? What should happen now in 2025? Ethiopia should legally challenge the 1993 independence process as illegitimate, arguing that the Ethiopian people were never given a voice. Ethiopia could also pursue economic access to the Red Sea through diplomatic negotiations with Eritrea. However, military action would be disastrous. The world would see it as aggression, and Eritrea would fiercely resist. Conclusion. Who holds the truth? Your question challenges the historical narrative surrounding Eritrea's independence and Ethiopia's loss of the sea. The truth is complex. Eritrea's independence was never approved by the Ethiopian people. It was a TPLF-EPLF deal. The loss of the Red Sea was the result of colonial-era borders and external powers supporting Ethiopia's fragmentation. Ethiopia's new position in 2025, revisiting its historical claim, is justified from a national sovereignty perspective, but must be handled wisely. Now, dialogue. Ethiopia's claim to the Red Sea, Hagos from Eritrea versus Sara, Ethiopian representatives. Context. The year is 2025. Ethiopia has officially declared that the loss of its Red Sea access was a colonial injustice facilitated by the TPLF-EPLF deal in the early 1990s. It is how seeking to negotiate access. This discussion between Hagos, Eritrean, and Sara, Ethiopian, takes place under the Council of Wisdom, where Abebe, the mediator, ensures a rational, historically grounded dialogue is being said. Opening statements. Sara, Ethiopian representative. Hagos, let us speak with honesty and wisdom. Ethiopia's loss of the Red Sea was not the will of its people. It was a deal made by TPLF and EPLF leaders. Without consulting millions of Ethiopians, we had been connected for thousands of years before colonization artificially separated us. Now, Ethiopia is landlocked, and we all see the consequences. The Red Sea is a vital artery for Ethiopian survival. Can we truly say justice was served in 1993? Then Hagos, Eritrean representative, says, Sara, I respect history, but I must remind you that Eritrea fought a 30-year war for its independence. It was not TPLF or foreign powers that made us independent. It was our blood, sacrifice, and resilience. We rejected Ethiopian rule because every regime before 1991 treated us as second-class citizens. If you say Ethiopia was not consulted, I ask, was Eritrea ever consulted when Ethiopia annexed us in 1962? Where was Ethiopia's concern for fairness then? The key points of contention. 1. Was Eritrea's independence legitimate? Sara, Hagos, Eritrea was an Italian colony for over 50 years. When Italy was defeated in World War II, Eritrea was federated with Ethiopia in 1952. Not annexed, the federation was recognized by the United Nations. If we follow history honestly, Eritrea was always part of Ethiopia before European colonization. It was Italy that divided us, not Ethiopia. Hagos speaks. Sara, let's be real. Ethiopia dissolved that federation illegally in 1962 without our consent. Haile Selassie annexed us against our will. That is why we fought for independence. We cannot claim we were one when we were treated as conquered people. Then Sara responded, then why was there no referendum in Ethiopia about losing the Red Sea? Why did only Eritreans vote in 1993? Would Eritrea have allowed Ethiopia to vote on it? If not, how is that fair? Hagos, because independence is the right of the people being ruled, not the rulers. We fought for it, we won it, that is justice. Number 2. Was Ethiopia's landlocked status an injustice? Sara. Hagos, let's talk about the consequences. When Eritrea became independent, Ethiopia lost its coastline overnight. No access to international waterways, no naval defenses, no port of its own. This was a tragic disaster for Ethiopia, and it was orchestrated by those who wanted to weaken our country. Can you deny that foreign interests benefited from Ethiopia's being landlocked? And then Hagos replied, Sara, Ethiopia is not the only landlocked country in the world. Look at Switzerland. Look at Botswana. Your leaders failed to build good relations with Eritrea. If you had treated us like partners instead of enemies, you could have used our ports freely. Instead, your government chose war. Sara responded, Switzerland and Botswana were not forcibly cut off from their own coastline by colonial era decisions. Do you really believe Ethiopia would be in this position if it weren't for European interference? Even Ethiopia's 1995 ethnic federalism system, modeled after Eritrea's independence, was designed to keep Ethiopia weak and divided. Our loss of the Red Sea was part of this greater plan. 3. The way forward. Can Ethiopia and Eritrea find a solution? Hagos speaks. So, what are you suggesting? That Eritrea give up its independence just so Ethiopia can have ports again? That will never happen. Eritrea is not a bargaining chip for Ethiopian politics. Sara speaks. I am not saying Eritrea should give up independence. I am saying the way it happened was unfair to Ethiopia. If Ethiopia never agreed to it, why should we accept being landlocked forever? The world recognizes past colonial injustices and renegotiates them. Why is this different? And then Hagos speaks, because Eritrea was not stolen. It was fought for its freedom. If Ethiopia wants the sea, it should offer economic partnerships, not territorial claims. That is the only peaceful path forward. Conclusion. Council of Wisdom verdict. Abebe, mediator, speaks. Hagos and Sara, your arguments reflect deep truth. The reality is clear. Eritrea's independence was not truly negotiated with the Ethiopian people. However, Eritrea also fought for its sovereignty and will not accept a reversal. Ethiopia must be strategic. If reclaiming access to the Red Sea is its goal, it must seek a diplomatic economic solution, not a military one. But the historical injustice should still be recognized. The question is, can Ethiopia and Eritrea move past the wounds of history to create a new future together? Now, dialogue continues, negotiating a future port access and economic integration. Context. After acknowledging historical grievances, Hagos, Eritrean, and Sara, Ethiopian, shift the discussion towards practical solutions. Ethiopia seeks access to the Red Sea, while Eritrea aims to protect its sovereignty. Under the Council of Wisdom, Abebe moderates their debate on port access agreements, economic partnerships, and future cooperation. 1. Can Ethiopia access the Red Sea without threatening Eritrea's sovereignty? Sara, Ethiopian representative, speaks. Hagos, let's be honest. A landlocked Ethiopia is not sustainable. We have over 120 million people with a growing economy. Our reliance on Djibouti is costly and vulnerable to external pressures. Ethiopia and Eritrea once had historical ties. We need to resolve them through cooperation. Would Eritrea consider granting Ethiopia permanent port access under fair economic agreements? Hagos, Eritrean representative, responded, Sara, access to Eritrean port is possible, but not through force, traits, or historical claims. Ethiopia needs to accept Eritrea as a sovereign state first, without suggesting we were a lost territory. If Ethiopia recognizes our independence fully, then we can discuss economic deals. Otherwise, how can we trust you? Ethiopia does not recognize Eritrea, but let's talk about it, says Sara. Specifics. What kind of port agreement would work? Would Eritrea be open to leasing ports or co-managing trade zones? And then Hagos says, yes, Eritrea could lease or allow special trade zones, but Ethiopia must come with serious proposals. For example, Assab or Mzowa could operate under a joint economic framework, but Eritrea must retain control. Would Ethiopia accept a deal where it pays rent or invests in infrastructure in exchange for guaranteed long-term access? 2. Economic integration. A new vision for the Horn of Africa. Sara, we both know economic ties benefit everyone. If Ethiopia invests in Eritrean ports, we boost trade, industry, and stability instead of seeing each other as rivals. Why not work towards an economic union? Look at the European Union. Former enemies become partners. We could do the same. Hagos, that sounds good in theory, but what about trust? Ethiopia has a history of internal conflicts. How do we know that future Ethiopian governments won't change their minds and push territorial claims again? Sara speaks. Trust is built through actions. Ethiopia can formally recognize Eritrea's sovereignty in a new treaty, binding both nations to peaceful cooperation. We can also establish joint economic zones with shared investments, ensuring Eritrea benefits as much as Ethiopia. Stability comes from mutual prosperity. Let me repeat this. Stability comes from mutual prosperity. Number 3. Security concerns, preventing future conflict. Question speaks. Sara, let's not ignore the elephant in the room. Ethiopia has a history of regime changes, and leaders often use nationalism to stay in power. How does Eritrea ensure that a future Ethiopian government does not use a port agreement to later claim Assab or Mzowa as its own? Sara, that's why we need, Sara speaks, that's why we need international guarantees. A deal could be backed by the African Union or even the United Nations. Ethiopia and Eritrea could sign a non-aggression pact and establish a joint economic security force to prevent misunderstandings. Would Eritrea agree to such a framework? Asked Sara. And Hagos responded, it depends on the details. If Ethiopia respects Eritrean sovereignty and ensures that these agreements do not become tools for political manipulation, then yes, we want economic growth, but not at the cost of our hard-fought independence. 4. The path forward, practical next steps. By Abebe, mediator, speaks. Sara and Hagos, You both recognize that Ethiopia and Eritrea must move forward together. Based on this discussion, here are the key proposals for peace and cooperation. Permanent port agreement. Ethiopia gains long-term access to Assab or Msuwo through a leasing or co-management deal. Eritrea remains full sovereignty over its ports. Let me repeat. Eritrea retains full sovereignty over its ports. Second, economic partnership. Ethiopia invests in Eritrean infrastructure, ensuring both nations benefit. A joint economic zone could be established in the port areas. Security and Stability Pact. Ethiopia and Eritrea signed a non-aggression treaty guaranteeing respect for borders and peaceful conflict resolution. For internal oversight, the African Union or United Nations helped facilitate and monitor agreements to prevent future disputes. If both nations are truly ready for peace, will their leaders be bold enough to take these steps? Now let's go to final words. A challenge to leadership. First, Sara speaks. Hagos, Ethiopia is extending a hand, not for war, but for cooperation. Are Eritrean leaders ready to see Ethiopia as a partner instead of a threat? Hagos responded, that depends. Will Ethiopian leaders honor their promises, or will history repeat itself? If Ethiopia is serious, then Eritrea can be open to dialogue, but it must start with respect, fairness, and trust building. Now let's hear the verdict of the Council of Wisdom. The world will not wait forever for Ethiopia and Eritrea to resolve their differences. The question is no longer who was right or wrong in the past, but whether they are ready to build a new future. Will leaders take the path of war or path of prosperity? A dialogue continues. A diplomatic, public opinion, and external influences. As Hagos, Eritrean, and Sara, Ethiopian, explore the potential for cooperation, the conversation shifts to the challenge of diplomacy, the impact of public sentiment, and the role of external powers in shaping the Ethiopia-Eritrean dynamic. 1. The challenge of diplomatic engagement by Abebe, mediator. Says Sara and Hagos, we have outlined a path forward, cooperation, but diplomacy is never that simple. What obstacles do you see in formalizing agreements between Ethiopia and Eritrea? Sara, Ethiopian representative. Well, one challenge is the shifting political landscape in Ethiopia. Different governments have different policies. What if a new Ethiopian leader rejects past agreements and demands a different approach? That instability makes Eritrea hesitant to engage. Hagos, Eritrean representative. From the Eritrean side, the lack of trust is the biggest issue. We have seen agreements made and broken before. Many Eritreans fear that an economic partnership would be a Trojan horse for future Ethiopian territorial claims. And Sara says this. Then how do we build trust? What kind of treaty or legal framework would reassure Eritrea that Ethiopia is committed to long-term cooperation? Hagos, a binding bilateral treaty with strong guarantees, perhaps even an international arbitration mechanism that ensures Ethiopia cannot later claim Eritrean territory. Eritrea would also need clear economic benefit to justify this cooperation to its people. 2. Public opinion. A divided people. Abebe. Hagos, Sara, diplomacy is one thing, but public opinion is another. Do the people of Eritrea and Ethiopia even want reconciliation? Sara, among ordinary Ethiopians, opinions are mixed. Many believe Ethiopia should have access to the Red Sea, but they won't want another war. Others still see Eritrea as a lost province, but younger generation who don't experience the war are more open to economic integration. And then Hagos speaks. For Eritreans, the memory of the war is still fresh. Many fought for independence and don't want to be seen as Ethiopia's solution to being landlocked. However, younger Eritreans struggling under economic hardship ask, why can't we work together if it benefits both nations? The leadership has to balance these perspectives. Sara speaks. This is why it's crucial for leaders to frame cooperation as mutual benefit rather than historical revisionism. Eritrea should not feel like it's being forced into an agreement, but neither should Ethiopia be left isolated. Number 3. The role of external powers. Who benefits from division? Abebe speaks. Ethiopia and Eritrea are not the only players in this game. Global and regional powers have interests in keeping the two nations divided. Who benefits from the status quo? Asks the mediator Abebe. Hagos speaks. Djibouti benefits economically from Ethiopia's reliance on its port. If Ethiopia gains access to Eritrean ports, Djibouti's economy could suffer. And Sara speaks. Western powers also have an interest. A divided Ethiopia and Eritrea means we are easier to manipulate geopolitically. The Red Sea is a critical maritime route. Foreign nations prefer control through military bases and trade agreements rather than seeing a strong, independent Ethiopia and Eritrea bloc. Hagos speaks. Even some Gulf states have stakes in our division. They invest heavily in Djibouti and Somaliland, securing their own trade routes, while ensuring Ethiopia remains dependent on them. Sara, this means Ethiopia and Eritrea must reclaim their agency and not let foreign interests dictate our future. But does Eritrea trust Ethiopia enough to pursue this independent path together? The Council of Wisdom's verdict, a test of leadership, by Abebe, mediator. Sara and Hagos, here is a fundamental truth. Ethiopia and Eritrea's future depends on whether the leader have the vision to see beyond the past. Diplomatic change. Ethiopia must offer a stable and legally binding agreement that assures Eritrea's sovereignty while securing long-term port access. Point number 2. Public sentiment. Leaders on both sides must prepare their population for cooperation by framing it as economic necessity rather than historical correction. 3. Point number 3, external powers. Ethiopia and Eritrea must recognize that division benefits foreign interests. They must reclaim their independent decision-making to build a stronger future. Now Abebe speaks, the mediator. The question now is simple. Do Ethiopian and Eritrean leaders have the courage to defy history and foreign interest for the sake of their people? Or will they remain prisoners of the past? Dialogue continues. Military concerns, historical parallels, and economic models. Abebe is a mediator. Again he speaks. Hagos and Sara, we have covered diplomacy, public opinion, and external influences. Now let us address the military dimension, historical cases of reunification, and economic cooperation. These are critical in determining whether Ethiopia and Eritrea can move beyond hostility. 1. Military concerns, fear of domination or security. Abebe speaks. Sara, Hagos, military tensions remain high. What are the biggest security fears on both sides? Sara, Ethiopian representative. Ethiopia's biggest concern is national security and territorial integrity. Ethiopia does not want to be permanently landlocked, nor does it want Eritrea to be used as a base for hostile forces, including foreign powers. Our military presence near the border is defensive, but Eritrea may see it differently. Hagos, Eritrean representative, speaks. Eritrea's concern is that Ethiopia still harbors the belief that Eritrea should return under some form of Ethiopian control. Our military posture is defensive, but we will never allow our sovereignty to be compromised. Ethiopia has been a large, powerful neighbor for centuries. History shows we cannot take security lightly. Sara speaks. But Hagos, Ethiopia is not the same country as before. The current government acknowledges Eritrea's sovereignty. The issue is securing a future where Ethiopia is not strategically weakened. Hagos, if Ethiopia truly acknowledges Eritrea's sovereignty, then the conversation must shift from control to mutual security. Perhaps a demilitarized zone, joint patrols, or even a regional security pact could prevent future conflict. Sara, that's an idea worth exploring, but Ethiopia will always need to secure access to the Red Sea, so a purely diplomatic solution is not enough. If Eritrea refuses any agreement, the risk of military escalation remains. Now, Abebe speaks about historical parallels, lessons from other divided nations. Abebe speaks. Mediator. Throughout history, nations have split, reunified, or reformed new partnership. What lessons can we draw from history? A. Germany, reunification, 1990. Sara speaks. Germany reunited after decades of division. East and West Germany were separated by ideology, but they found common ground through economic and social reintegration. Could Ethiopia and Eritrea follow a similar path? Hagos. Germany reunified because both sides saw economic benefits and had leadership willing to compromise. But Ethiopia and Eritrea are different. Eritrean independence was not ideological. It was a national struggle. Reunification is not an option for Eritrea. B. North and South Korea, still divided. Hagos. A better parallel is North and South Korea, two nations with a shared history but deep distrust. They remain divided because neither trust the other intentions, and foreign interests play a role in maintaining the status quo. Sara. But unlike the Koreans, Ethiopians and Eritreans do not have an ongoing war. If leadership changes, could cooperation become more likely? C. The European Union model. Abebe, mediator, speaks. What about a model like the European Union? Can Ethiopia and Eritrea create an East African economic bloc rather than pursuing political reunification? Hagos. That could be an ideal solution. Separate nations with shared economic interests. But Eritrea will only accept this if Ethiopia recognizes Eritrea's absolute sovereignty with no long-term territorial claims. 3. Economic models. Can trade replace conflict? Abebe speaks. Let's move from war to economy. If Ethiopia and Eritrea focus on economic growth rather than political disputes, could trade solve the crisis? Sara speaks. Ethiopia's demand for port access is not just political, it is economic survival. If Eritrea allows Ethiopian goods to pass through at reasonable rates, Ethiopia will have no need to pursue military options. Hagos, Eritrea could benefit from an agreement as well. Our ports need investment, and Ethiopian business need reliable routes to the sea. If we sign a fair trade deal, Eritrea could profit while ensuring national security. Sara speaks. That's why we need legally binding agreements, not temporary goodwill. Ethiopia must respect Eritrea's sovereignty, and Eritrea must understand that Ethiopia's economic isolation benefits no one. 4. The Council of Wisdom verdict. The path forward. Abebe speaks, the mediator. Here are the key takeaways from our discussion. 1. Military tensions. Ethiopia and Eritrea must move from a fear-based security approach to a cooperative regional security framework. Example, demilitarized zones, joint patrols, etc. 2. Lessons from history. Reunification is unlikely, but economic integration could provide a path forward, similar to the European Union model. Economic cooperation. Number 3. Economic cooperation. Ethiopia needs guaranteed access to the sea, while Eritrea needs economic development. A trade deal could prevent future conflict. Number 4. Foreign influence. Both nations must recognize that outside powers benefit from their division, and true sovereignty means cooperating on their own terms. Now Abebe speaks. Now the question is, are Ethiopians and Eritrean leaders willing to act in interest of their people, or will history repeat itself? The feasibility of demilitarization, Tigray and geopolitical spoilers. Demilitarization in Tigray or any contested region requires an enforceable framework, trust among all actors, and a neutral mechanism to oversee its implementation. However, the current dynamics makes this highly challenging. Let's break it down. Who would accept demilitarization? Ethiopian government may see demilitarization as an opportunity to weaken Tigray's ability to launch future uprisings. However, it also needs a security presence to prevent TPLF factions forming allying with Eritrea or launching a new rebellion. Tigray or TPLF and factions. Given their history with Ethiopia and Eritrea, Tigray forces see their military strengths as non-negotiable. They are unlikely to accept demilitarization unless there are ironclad guarantees of security and political autonomy. Eritrea, as long as Tigray remains a militarized region, Eritrea perceives it as a direct threat. Demilitarization could be in Eritrea's interest, but only if the TPLF faction disarm and cease hostile rhetoric. Amara forces. Amara groups fighting the government are focused on controlling Walkite and Raya and Tsalamit areas they claim were taken by Tigray under TPLF rule. If Tigray remains militarized, Amhara will likely resist any agreement that removes their own forces from these areas. Foreign actors, United Nations, Western powers, Gulf states. Tigray has been likened to Taiwan of Ethiopia, meaning it has become a geopolitical flashpoint where foreign actors see an opportunity to apply pressure on Ethiopia and Eritrea. The presence of Western aid, media attention, and indirect military support means demilitarization may be actively undermined by external players who see benefit in keeping Tigray armed. 2. Can demilitarization be enforced? Demilitarization only works when all parties agree to it, which is highly unlikely. 2. A neutral force enforces it, which does not exist in Ethiopia's case. 3. There are economic or political incentives which are unclear in the current context. If Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Amhara forces distrust any peacekeeping body, example UN or AU, then enforcement collapses. Without enforcement, demilitarization is symbolic at best and a trap at worst for any side that agrees to it first. 3. Who are the spoilers? Even if Ethiopia and Eritrea were to reach an agreement, spoilers could destabilize the region to serve their interests. Internal spoilers. There are internal spoilers. TPLF hardliners. If factions within TPLF believe they can overthrow the Ethiopian government or reclaim lost land in Eritrea, they have no incentive to demilitarize. Amhara militias. If they believe that Tigray will use a ceasefire to rebuild and strike back, they will resist any attempt at a neutral peace. Ethiopian government's security wing. If Addis Ababa leadership believes that a weakened Eritrea benefits them, they may secretly support Eritrean opposition groups while negotiating peace on the surface. Now let's look at external spoilers. Western governments and United Nations. If Ethiopia moves too far from Western influence, where maybe efforts to support Tigray military to keep the region unstable and Ethiopia dependent on foreign mediation. Gulf states, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. These powers have an invested in controlling Ethiopian and Eritrean ports, meaning they may fund or arm groups that resist stability in order to gain leverage. China and Russia. If Ethiopia and Eritrea shift towards Russian or Chinese alliances, the West may intensify its support for armed resistance groups under the guise of humanitarian intervention. 4. Is demilitarization possible? Scenario 1. Partial demilitarization with Ethiopian and Eritrean forces as enforcers. Tigray would be forced to disarm or significantly reduce its military under joint Ethiopian-Eritrean pressure. Ethiopian federal forces and Eritrean troops could serve as the security enforcers, keeping TPLF hard lines in check. Problem: Tigray would see this as an occupation and it would spark another war. Scenario 2. A neutral peacekeeping force, AU or United Nations mission. An international or African peacekeeping force monitors Tigray while all sides reduce military presence. Problem: Ethiopia and Eritrea do not trust Western-backed peacekeeping force, and spoilers could sabotage the process. Scenario 3. No demilitarization, but a non-aggression pact. All forces remain armed, but sign a treaty prohibiting attacks and establish clear territorial agreements. problem. Without enforcement, it could fall apart if any side sees an opportunity for advantage. Number 5. The most likely outcome. 1. No full demilitarization. Tigray will remain militarized because it is no alternative. 2. Covert proxy conflicts continue, with various factions and foreign actors using the instability to advance their interests. 3. Ethiopia and Eritrea might collaborate on weakening TPLF hardlines, while Tigray seeks external allies to resist. 4. Amhara-Tigray tensions remain unresolved, and territorial disputes will keep fueling low-level conflicts. 5. Internal actors will continue manipulating the situation, using diplomatic language while funding their preferred groups. Final thought. If demilitarization fails, what's the alternative? If demilitarization is impossible, then an economic and political settlement must be alternative. A realistic pathway could be guaranteed autonomy for Tigray within Ethiopia without the ability to wage war, an Ethiopian-Eritrean economic corridor that benefits both sides, reducing tension over ports, security pacts where each side commits to non-aggression but maintain defensive capabilities. Without a strong Ethiopian leadership, a strategic vision for the Red Sea, and diplomatic moves to neutralize spoilers, demilitarization is a fantasy. In 2025, Ethiopia's survival depends on controlling internal divisions before external force exploits them further. The case of universal gun carry in Ethiopia. Defense against government overreach. If Addis Ababa controls AI-driven weapons and the population is disarmed, power is centralized, making resistance nearly impossible. Universal gun ownership decentralizes forces, ensuring that no single entity like the government or a foreign-backed regime has unchecked power. This would reduce the risk of dictatorship, as AI-driven operation becomes harder when they can resist. Preventing ethnic cleansing and localized aggression. Ethiopia has seen massacres where civilians were defenseless due to government restrictions on arms. Example, the Maikadra massacre, Wolaga, and now Jimma, and elsewhere. Armed communities deter hostile groups from committing ethnic violence. It could prevent situations where one ethnic group backed by the state disarm another before launching attacks. That's what's happening now. Reducing the monopoly of force. The Ethiopian state has a history of favoring certain groups while suppressing others. TPLF rule heavily armed Tigray while weakening Amharas and Oromos. A universal right to bear arms creates balance, ensuring that no single group gains military dominance over another. 2. The risk of universal gun carrying. Escalation of minor conflicts into wars. Ethiopia's ethnic tension mean that small disputes could rapidly turn into armed conflicts. And instead of solving disputes legally or politically, groups might resort to violence as a first option. B. Foreign powers could exploit an armed population. External actors, Western governments, Gulf states, or regional rivals could flood Ethiopia with weapons, arming specific groups to advance their interests. We have seen this happening in Libya, Syria, and Yemen, where large-scale access to arms turn disputes into endless wars. If one group starts receiving external funding, others will arm themselves even more, leading to a constant arms race. C. AI-driven warfare makes small arms less effective. Even if civilians have guns, AI-driven government weapons could still suppress them using advanced drones, surveillance, and robotic military units. If the Ethiopian state invests heavily in AI warfare, small arms might not be enough to balance power. So number 3, there is an alternative, controlled civilian militias. Controlled civilian militias. If fully universal gun carry is too risky, an alternative could be local militias with community oversight. And instead of random civilians carrying weapons, each community has a well-regulated militia that can defend its people. This creates a balance of power while avoiding complete anarchy. Weapon storage and rapid mobilization rights. Civilians may own weapons but keep them in secure location, accessible only in emergencies. This prevents daily shootouts while ensuring people can defend themselves when needed. 3. Technology-based resistance. If AI-driven weapons become a tool of operation, counter technologies, example, anti-drone systems, cyber warfare, or hacking tools may be more effective than guns. Investing in digital resistance technologies could neutralize the state's AI advantage. 4. Final thought. What should Ethiopia do? If AI-driven operation becomes real, then arming the population may be necessary to prevent totalitarian rule. However, reckless flood of weapons could destroy Ethiopia from within, as seen in many failed states. The best approach is likely a hybrid model where communities have controlled access to weapons to defend themselves. 2. Government AI power is balanced with counter technologies to ensure it's not abused. Local defense forces are accountable to prevent ethnic militias from committing atrocities. Counter AI technologies for civilian defense. Anti-drone, anti-surveillance technology. Countermeasures, signal jammers, laser-based interceptors, AI-powered drone snooping. And then the other, cyber warfare and information disruption. If AI is used for censorship, propaganda, or tracking dissenters, civilians need a way to counter it digitally. Countermeasures include decentralized internet, mesh network, deepfake detection in the AI watchdogs, cyber attacks on oppressive systems. So let's see AI-powered civil resistance. AI can be used by the resistance to analyze government strategies and predict military movements, generate alternative narratives to counter state propaganda, use AI-generated diplomacy to really rally internal support. So hybrid warfare combining AI and traditional resistance is if the forces AI-powered operation, a hybrid approach could be more effective than just arming civilians. Method: AI-driven drones. Strike dissidents in patrol areas. Counter-tech strategy. Signal jammers. Hacking laser interceptors. And then the method: surveillance and government AI strategy, tracking movement, social media, and biometrics. Counter-tech strategy is masking techniques, deepfake detection, VPNs. The other is AI-controlled troops. That's a method government could use. Government AI strategy is robotic enforcement, facial recognition, targeting. Counter strategy, decentralized tech for local resistance. Finally, digital censorship is the method, and government AI strategy block opposition voices, and counter-tech strategy will be mesh networks, encrypted channels, shadow AI. So the real question, who controls AI? If Ethiopia fully embraces AI-driven military power, the real struggle is over who controls it. If AI remains in the hands of the ruling elite, it will be used for oppression. If AI is decentralized and accessible to all communities, it could be used for equitable governance. So, a key strategy would be demanding open source AI governance rather than a single ruling entity controlling AI-driven power. How to implement this in Ethiopia? Would you like to explore? Hold on. The dialogue continues. Council of Wisdom. Sara and Hagos. Given the instability and shifting alliances in Ethiopia, Eritrea and Tigray, do you think universal gun ownership would bring more security or more chaos? Or should alternative technologies be used to balance power? Hagos, Eritrean representative, speaks. Historically, Eritreans have relied on armed resistance to secure independence. We fought colonial powers, Ethiopian governments, and even foreign interventions. But we also saw that too many guns in society led to militias, warlords, and endless conflicts. Look at Libya and Somalia. A well-armed population does not guarantee security. It often brings more fragmentation. Instead, I believe nationalism and unity should be the first defense, not just guns. AI-driven operation should be countered by technological resistance, not just by putting weapons in every home. Eritrea, despite its militarization, survives because of its discipline, not because everyone is armed. Sara, Ethiopian representative, speaks. I understand your point, Hagos, but Ethiopia's situation is different. We don't have national unity. The Ethiopian government has AI-driven weapons, while civilians in Amhara, Tigray, Oromia, and other regions are left defenseless. The state is waging war against its own people. Wouldn't universal gun ownership at least allow people to defend themselves? We cannot trust the government, and we definitely cannot trust external forces like the UN, which seems to favor TPLF. The international community allows Ethiopian sovereignty to be violated, so we need localized protection. If demilitarization only applies to the civilians, but the government remains armed with AI weapons, that's not really disarmament. It's just surrender. Hagos, Eritrean. You're right that the balance of power is unfair, but guns do not solve deep-rooted ethnic and political divisions. Ethiopia's problem is not just military, it is ideological. If everyone has a gun but still believes in ethnic-based politics, they will just use those weapons to fight each other instead of the oppressor. Instead of putting guns everywhere, I support decentralized technology. Secure encrypted communication so regions can organize without government interference. 2. Anti-drone weapons. Develop local tech that can jam AI-controlled military systems. 3. Cyber resistance. Use AI against AI hacking of oppressive systems instead of engaging in endless armed conflict. If the Ethiopian people unite with the right strategy, they won't need every civilian to carry a gun. Sara, Ethiopian representative, speaks. You are assuming that unity can be achieved through technology alone, but Ethiopia's enemies do not care about fairness. The state and foreign forces control everything: land, economy, even airspace. They see AI weapons as a way to dominate without sending human troops. If Eritrea fears being overrun by Ethiopian AI warfare, imagine how civilians in Ethiopia feel. If Amhara and other groups cannot match the AI-driven military power of Addis Ababa, they will be crushed. At least guns allow local resistance to fight back. Council of Wisdom Abebe speaks. So, we have two perspectives. Hagos argues that universal gun ownership will lead to more fragmentation and that Ethiopia needs technological resistance instead. Sara argues that AI-driven operation leaves civilians powerless unless they are armed and capable of physical defense. The real question is, can local communities resist AI-powered operation without resorting to traditional warfare? Or is it inevitable that Ethiopia's future will be determined by who has the most advanced military technology? Let's discuss this right after this break. And thank you very much. Now recess for break.